In the heart of Texas, where neighborhoods stretched wide and families anchored their lives in suburban comfort, Suzanne Simpson's story began as one that could have belonged to anyone. She was a mother of four, a realtor by trade, and the kind of woman who seemed to embody the balancing act of modern motherhood: professional, nurturing, active in her community, and committed to her family. To friends and neighbors, she appeared to live the life so many aspired to: a stable marriage, a lively home filled with children, and a career that allowed her both independence and flexibility. She was admired for her warmth, her professionalism, and the way she carried herself with grace despite the chaos that comes with raising four children. Suzanne's days were filled with the rhythm of real estate appointments and school schedules. She could be found touring homes with clients in the mornings, rushing back to attend school functions in the afternoons, then making sure homework was done and dinner was on the table in the evenings. Her children were her pride, her reason for everything, and she poured herself into them with the devotion only a mother of four could understand. Neighbors recalled her smile, her laughter, the way she always seemed to have energy even after long days. She wasn't just a parent, she was present, engaged, and tireless. Her career as a realtor suited her. She had an approachable nature that put clients at ease, and she knew the neighborhoods well. Suzanne believed in the power of home, not just as a physical space, but as a foundation for family. It was a philosophy that made her effective in her work and beloved by clients. People trusted her. They felt that she wasn't just trying to sell them a house. She wanted them to find a place where they could build memories, where they could belong. At the center of her personal world was her husband, with whom she had built what appeared to be a solid family life. Outwardly, theirs was a marriage that seemed to function as a partnership. Together, they raised their children, shared responsibilities, and presented to others as a stable couple. But as is often the case in true crime, the image projected outward was not necessarily the reality inside the home. There were whispers of tension, moments of unease, subtle cracks in the foundation of what others believed to be a happy marriage. Those who knew Susan best understood that she was resilient, but they also noticed that she sometimes seemed weighed down, as though carrying burdens she didn't always speak about. Marriage, motherhood, and career were demanding enough, but there were signs that her relationship with her husband was not as perfect as it seemed. Disagreements surfaced more frequently, frustrations lingered, and though Suzanne rarely aired her struggles publicly, close friends began to sense her unhappiness. Still, Suzanne was the kind of woman who pushed forward. She was determined to keep things together for her children, to maintain the stability they needed. Divorce was not a word she threw around lightly. She had built her identity around being a mother and a provider, and she believed in holding her family together through storms. Her children adored her. To them, she was not only their caretaker but their anchor. She attended their events, listened to their stories, guided them with patience. They relied on her for everything: structure, love, comfort. In return, she drew strength from them. They were her constant motivation, the reason she worked so hard, the reason she endured. The neighborhood where the Simpson family lived was the kind of place where people waved at each other from driveways and kept an eye out for one another's kids. Suzanne fit seamlessly into this environment, making friends among other parents, participating in community events, and building a reputation as reliable and kind. She seemed to have it all: the house, the career, the family, the life that others envied. But beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy, something darker was brewing. As investigators would later piece together, Suzanne's marriage had been strained for longer than anyone realized. The arguments had grown sharper, the silences colder. And while Suzanne remained dedicated to her children, she was less certain about the man she had built her life with. To friends, she occasionally confided hints of dissatisfaction, though never in dramatic terms. She was private, careful not to let too much slip. The contrast between Suzanne's vibrant exterior and the hidden struggles within her marriage set the stage for what would eventually unfold. She was a woman who seemed to have everything under control, and yet she was standing on fragile ground. To her children, she was irreplaceable. To her clients, she was a trusted professional. To her neighbors, she was a friendly presence. But to her husband, she had become something else: a source of conflict. A reminder of a life he no longer controlled. A woman whose independence and resilience made him feel diminished in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The signs were there for those who looked closely enough. Suzanne seemed distracted at times, as though preoccupied with worries she didn't want to share. There were subtle changes in her routine, moments of tension between her and her husband that others picked up on but couldn't fully interpret. Friends sensed something was wrong but didn't know how serious it was. And then, on an ordinary day, Suzanne vanished. The shock rippled immediately through her community. A mother of four does not simply disappear without explanation. Her absence was noticed within hours. Children left without their mother, appointments missed, a sudden silence where there had always been presence. People searched for answers, and quickly suspicion fell not on strangers, but on the one person who should have been her partner, her protector, her husband. As the investigation began, the picture of Suzanne's life grew sharper in hindsight. She had been a woman of strength, a mother who lived for her children, a professional who built trust, a neighbor who spread warmth. Her disappearance was not only a crime, but a rupture in the fabric of her community. The mystery was not just what had happened to her, but how someone so central to so many lives could be erased in an instant, and though her body was never found. The evidence, the surveillance, the inconsistencies, the suspicions began to point in one direction. It suggested a betrayal from within her own home, a crime born not of chance, but of control. Resentment enraged at Suzanne's story, once one of family, work, and motherhood, was about to transform into a haunting tale of loss, suspicion, and unanswered questions. The day Suzanne Simpson disappeared began like any other in the neighborhood. It was the kind of day where the Texas sun rose high, casting light over manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs, where children's laughter floated faintly in the distance and neighbors busied themselves with errands. On the surface, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet for Suzanne's family, that day marked the beginning of an unraveling that would never be repaired. Suzanne had appointments scheduled. As a realtor, her calendar was rarely empty. Clients depended on her punctuality, her reliability, her ability to walk them through the complicated process of buying or selling a home. Missing an appointment was not something Suzanne did casually. It wasn't in her nature. But that day, she missed one. Then another. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left without reply. Hours passed, and the silence grew louder. Her friends began to worry almost immediately. A mother of four could be late, yes, but she could not simply vanish. Her children noticed her absence first with confusion, then with fear. They waited for her to walk through the door, for her voice to call out from the hallway, but she didn't come. The family home, once filled with her energy, felt strangely hollow. When police were contacted, the urgency was clear. Missing adults are sometimes treated with caution, as though they might have chosen to leave, but Suzanne's situation was different. She was a mother with deep ties to her community, children who needed her, a job that required her presence. Her sudden absence was an alarm bell. Investigators began with the most basic question: when and where was Suzanne last seen? The answers were complicated. Her husband provided one version of events, but as detectives began to probe, inconsistencies emerged. His timeline shifted, his details wavered, and his explanations failed to satisfy. He insisted that Suzanne had left the house on her own, that perhaps she needed space, that she had gone off somewhere voluntarily. But for those who knew her, that story rang false. Suzanne would never abandon her children. She would never disappear without explanation. Then came the surveillance footage. Investigators pieced together camera records from surrounding areas, from neighbors, from businesses. What they found didn't match her husband's account. It suggested movement inconsistent with his claims, activity that raised more questions than answers. There were moments when his vehicle appeared where it shouldn't have been, times that didn't align with the story he told. Detectives noticed his behavior, his body language in interviews. The way he seemed more concerned with controlling the narrative than with finding his wife. Meanwhile, neighbors and friends stepped forward with their impressions. They described tension between Suzanne and her husband, arguments that had grown more frequent in recent months, an unease that seemed to hang in the air. Some recalled overhearing raised voices. Others remembered Suzanne confiding that things were not as stable as they seemed. These accounts, combined with the husband's shaky alibi, painted a troubling picture that in cases of disappearance, the spouse is always scrutinized first, and in Suzanne's case, Suspicion landed heavily on her husband. His demeanor, his lack of urgency, his contradictions, all pointed investigators in his direction. He insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance, but his actions betrayed him. Surveillance suggested movements late at night, trips that had no explanation. Friends whispered that he had been controlling, that he had resented Suzanne's independence, that the marriage had been deteriorating for some time. As the investigation deepened, the absence of Suzanne's body became the central torment. Without it, prosecutors faced hurdles, but investigators knew that a lack of a body did not mean a lack of a crime. The forensic trail, the digital evidence, the surveillance, the behavioral red flags began to construct a case even without physical remains. Her children clung to hope in the early days, asking where their mother was, believing she might walk through the door at any moment. But as the days stretched into weeks, the hope dimmed. The house felt different without her. The meals were quieter, the laughter faded, the sense of safety evaporated. Suzanne had been the heart of the family, and without her, the center collapsed. In the community, the disappearance dominated conversation. Neighbors checked their cameras, replayed footage, scoured their memories for anything unusual. Was there a sound they had ignored? A car that didn't belong? A movement in the night that should have been reported? The mystery seeped into every corner of their lives. A reminder that safety was fragile, the press began to cover the case, amplifying Suzanne's story across Texas. Headlines spoke of the missing mother of four, the dedicated realtor whose sudden absence made no sense. Photos of her smiling face filled screens, images of her with her children, her family portraits, her professional headshots. Each photo told the same story. This was a woman who should have been alive, present, raising her children. Her disappearance was unnatural, and her absence screamed foul play. As suspicion hardened around her husband, people watched him closely. They noted the odd ways he conducted himself in public, the lack of visible grief, the calmness that seemed misplaced. While others wept and searched, he seemed detached. Detectives took note. In countless cases, killers betray themselves not only through evidence, but through demeanor, and Suzanne's husband seemed to fall into that pattern. Still, he denied involvement. He told anyone who asked that he had no part in Suzanne's disappearance. He insisted she had left, that perhaps she was overwhelmed, that she had chosen to walk away. But his story found few believers. To her children, to her friends, to her clients, to investigators, the idea that Suzanne would abandon her life was impossible. She had too much to live for, too much responsibility, too much love for her children, and so the focus remained on him. Surveillance footage became the most damning piece, the silent witness that contradicted his words. It showed behavior that could not be easily explained, movements that suggested something hidden. Investigators pressed him, but he held his line, denying, deflecting, insisting. As weeks passed, the case against him grew in the shadows, built piece by detectives determined to find justice for Suzanne. Yet without a body, without a confession, without direct forensic evidence, the case was maddeningly incomplete. It was a puzzle missing its central piece, and yet everyone, her family, her neighbors, her friends, the police, believed they knew the truth. Suzanne was gone. And her husband was the reason why. The investigation into Suzanne Simpson's disappearance quickly shifted from searching for a missing woman to investigating a likely homicide. Detectives, seasoned by years of experience, recognized patterns. The sudden vanishing of a mother who had deep ties to her children and career. The inconsistencies in the husband's story. The absence of any credible evidence that Suzanne had left of her own accord. While the public still clung to hope that she might be found alive, law enforcement quietly shifted their focus. They were building a case, and they were building it against her husband. In the first days, officers had canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions, reviewing surveillance. Neighbors recounted ordinary evenings interrupted by nothing unusual, no screams, no disturbances, no obvious signs of violence. But in the digital records, investigators found what the human eye could not. Surveillance cameras captured her husband's movements in ways that contradicted his timeline. At hours when he claimed to be home, his vehicle was seen driving through streets, stopping in odd locations. The footage didn't show what he was doing, but it showed enough to raise alarms. Detectives began reconstructing his nights, hour by hour. They noted the unexplained trips, the gaps in time he couldn't account for, the moments where his explanations collapsed under scrutiny. Every inconsistency was logged, every lie documented. The picture was one of a man whose story was unraveling the closer investigators looked. Then came the interviews. Family members spoke of Suzanne's devotion to her children, her reliability, her character. They emphasized that she would never willingly abandon her family, never vanish without a word. They painted a portrait of a woman who had lived for her children, who had built her life around them. To suggest she had simply walked away was not just implausible, it was insulting to those who knew her. Her friends added layers to the story, describing a marriage that had been troubled. They recalled her confiding worries, hinting at arguments, describing a husband who could be controlling, sometimes cold, sometimes dismissive. These accounts were not dramatic enough to predict murder, but they laid a foundation of plausibility. Suzanne had been unhappy. Her marriage had been strained, and if she were gone, the husband's involvement was the most logical explanation. As detectives pressed the husband in interviews, his demeanor drew attention. Rather than frantic grief, he projected a cold detachment. He spoke of Suzanne's disappearance as though it were a problem to be managed, not a catastrophe that had upended his life. Investigators recognized the signs. They had seen it before in other cases: the emotional void where grief should have been, the performance of concern without its substance. His words said one thing, his body language another. He was too calm, too controlled, too rehearsed. The children, though shielded as much as possible, noticed it too. They asked questions, but the answers they received from their father were hollow. They longed for their mother, sensed the absence like a wound, and struggled to make sense of why she wasn't coming home. Their grief was raw, and their confusion cut deeper than words could capture. For detectives, the plight of the children was another reason to push harder. They deserved answers, they deserved justice, and they deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their mother. The media began circling the case with growing intensity. A realtor and mother of 4 missing, her husband under suspicion, a community shaken. The story had all the elements of a true crime mystery that captured public attention. News anchors framed it as another case of a wife disappearing under suspicious circumstances, hinting at the disturbing pattern of intimate partner violence hidden beneath the facade of normal marriages. Suzanne's smiling photos, at work, with her children, at family events, filled television screens, paired with images of police tape and patrol cars. For the public, the central question became, if the husband killed her, where was Suzanne's body? Without it, doubt lingered. Defense attorneys knew that cases without bodies were more difficult to prosecute. Juries often hesitated to convict without the physical proof of death, without the tangible confirmation of tragedy. Investigators knew this too, but they also knew that convictions had been won before on circumstantial evidence, and that sometimes the absence of a body was its own kind of evidence, pointing directly to a perpetrator desperate to hide his crime. The search for Suzanne's body expanded. Police scoured fields, wooded areas, remote stretches of land where her husband's vehicle had been spotted on surveillance. Dogs were brought in, cadaver units trained to detect the faintest trace of human remains. Volunteers joined, combing ditches, checking rural roadsides. Each day ended in frustration. Each lead collapsed into disappointment. Suzanne remained missing, and the earth kept its secrets. But even without a body, the case against her husband grew stronger. Forensic experts examined his vehicle, his home, his devices. They found traces of cleaning, behavior that suggested attempts to erase evidence. They uncovered search histories that raised eyebrows, inquiries into topics that hinted at preparation. Though not definitive, these fragments added weight to the growing suspicion that in the community, suspicion hardened into certainty. Neighbors whispered their belief that he had done it, that he had killed Suzanne and hidden her body. They watched him with quiet disgust, noting his coldness, his lack of visible grief. They stood by the children, offering support, rallying around them, trying to provide the warmth their mother had once given to Suzanne's family outside the home. Voiced their own suspicions more loudly. They had never trusted her husband fully, they said. They had sensed his controlling tendencies, his coldness. They believed with certainty that he was responsible. Their public statements added pressure to the investigation, their grief amplifying the demand for justice. For detectives, The challenge remained the same: how to move from suspicion to proof. They continued piecing together the surveillance, building a timeline that placed the husband in damning locations at damning times. They reviewed financial records, communications, anything that could connect him more directly to Suzanne's disappearance. Every scrap of evidence was vital in a case where the central piece, Suzanne's body, remained missing. As weeks turned into months, the case began to crystallize. Though her body had not been found, the story was increasingly clear to investigators. Suzanne had not vanished of her own accord. She had been murdered, and the man who was supposed to love and protect her had likely taken her life. The community lived in the shadow of her absence. Each school function her children attended without her was a reminder. Each for sale sign that bore her name but went unanswered was a ghostly echo of her presence. Her smile still appeared in photos, but her voice was silenced, her laughter gone, and her husband, under a cloud of suspicion, continued to insist on his innocence. He said he had done nothing wrong, that he was being unfairly targeted, that Suzanne had left on her own. But with each passing day, fewer people believed him. His story was a house of cards, and investigators were closing in. The Simpson case was no longer just a missing persons mystery. It was a test of truth against deception, of justice against denial, of whether a woman's life could be erased without consequence. And still, the most haunting question remained: where was Suzanne? The passage of time did nothing to dull the suspicion surrounding Suzanne Simpson's disappearance. What began as a frantic search for a missing mother had evolved into a murder case without a body, one in which every whisper, every piece of surveillance, every inconsistency pointed to the man closest to her. For her children and her community, the reality was unbearable. Suzanne wasn't coming back, and the person accused of taking her away was the same man who now stood in their kitchen. The man who had promised to protect her, the man who was supposed to love her. Detectives pressed forward with their case. They mapped out the husband's movements on the days around Suzanne's disappearance, showing jurors surveillance footage that revealed him in places he could not explain. They built a timeline that demonstrated not only opportunity, but intent. He had argued with her, controlled her, resented her independence, and now she was gone. Without a body, they leaned on circumstantial evidence, but it was evidence layered and heavy. His actions before and after Suzanne's disappearance betrayed him, investigators argued. His alibis collapsed, his demeanor cracked, and his explanations dissolved under scrutiny. The legal process was grueling. Prosecutors faced the monumental task of convincing a jury to convict without the most visceral piece of evidence: Suzanne's remains. Defense attorneys seized on that void, hammering at the absence of a body, suggesting that without it, there could be no certainty of death, no proof of murder. They floated alternative theories. Perhaps Suzanne had chosen to leave, perhaps she was alive somewhere else. But these stories clashed with everything known about her. A mother of 4 who lived for her children would not abandon them. A professional who built her career on trust would not vanish without a word. To those who knew her, the defense's arguments felt like insults, dismissals of the woman they loved. For her family, the trial was agony. They sat in court, listening to every detail, every suggestion, every theory. They watched the husband, his calmness as chilling as it had been since the day she vanished. They heard prosecutors describe a controlling man who could not stand to lose power, who saw Suzanne's independence as a threat, and who solved that perceived problem with violence. They heard defense attorneys insist on reasonable doubt, pointing again and again to the absence of a body. And they lived every moment as a reminder that Suzanne was gone. The children bore the heaviest burden. Too young to grasp the legal nuances, they understood only that their mother was not there, that their lives had shattered, and that their father stood accused of destroying everything they had known. The older ones struggled with conflicting emotions: grief for their mother, confusion and anger toward their father, despair at being caught between love and betrayal. The younger ones cried for their mother at night, asking questions no one could answer. Family members did their best to provide stability, but the loss was immeasurable. The house that had once been full of Suzanne's energy felt empty, haunted by absence. The community followed every development with intensity. Neighbors who had once waved at the couple from driveways now whispered about the husband's guilt. They remembered Suzanne's kindness, her presence, her laughter. They spoke of her at school events, at church gatherings, at neighborhood meetings. They wore ribbons in her honor, lit candles, and raised her name in prayer. She had been one of their own, and the violence done to her felt personal. As the trial unfolded, the evidence painted a damning picture. Surveillance placed the husband in suspicious locations at suspicious times. Forensic analysis suggested efforts to clean his vehicle. Digital records hinted at planning and concealment. Witnesses spoke of his controlling nature, of the tension that had defined the marriage in its final years. Though no body was found, the pieces formed a mosaic of guilt. The portrait was not complete, but it was clear, when the verdict came, it was a moment of catharsis and sorrow. The jury found him guilty. The weight of circumstantial evidence, the contradictions, the surveillance, the testimonies, together they overcame the absence of a body. Justice, in legal terms, had been served. But for Suzanne's family, it was justice without closure. Her body remained missing, her final resting place unknown. They would never be able to lay her to rest, never be able to say goodbye in the way they longed to. After the conviction, the aftermath unfolded quietly but painfully. The children were placed in the care of relatives, their lives forever altered. They carried the trauma of losing both parents, their mother to violence, their father to prison. The community continued to rally around them, offering support, fundraising, and presence. But nothing could replace what had been taken. Suzanne's case became part of a broader conversation about domestic violence, about the hidden dangers within seemingly ordinary marriages, about the risks women face in homes that appear stable from the outside. Advocates used her story to highlight the need for better awareness, for stronger protections, for vigilance in recognizing the signs of control and abuse. Her name became a warning, a reminder that silence can mask danger, that appearances can deceive, that tragedy often lurks closest to home. For her family, the years since her death have been marked by both grief and resilience. They continue to speak her name, to honor her memory, to ensure her children grow up knowing the truth of who their mother was, her warmth, her strength, her love. They cling to the hope that one day her body will be found, that they will be able to give her the burial she deserves. Until then, they live with the haunting uncertainty of not knowing where she rests. Suzanne Simpson's story remains one of betrayal and mystery, of justice served but incompletely, of a life cut short and a body never recovered. She was a mother, a professional, a friend, a neighbor. She was the heart of her family, the anchor of her children's lives. And though she is gone, her story continues to echo in her community, in Texas, and in the broader true crime world. In the end, Suzanne's case is remembered not only for its tragedy, but for the strength of those she left behind, her children, her family, her community, who refused to let her memory fade. It is remembered as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within the walls of a home, and as a testament to the enduring power of love, which keeps her name alive even in the silence of unanswered questions. Suzanne Simpson remains missing, but she is not forgotten.